The Forbidden Forge, the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Coalition, floated in the neutral zone between star systems, a massive crystalline structure that caught and reflected the light of three nearby suns. Commander Elena Vasquez stood at the center of the human delegation, her military bearing evident despite the diplomatic robes she wore. Around her, representatives from 47 alien species filled the tiered seats, their forms ranging from the serpentine Corthani to the gaseous nebula dwellers who existed in specialized containment suits. The Primarch of the Coalition, an ancient being whose species had achieved spaceflight when Earth's dinosaurs still roamed, raised 4 of its 6 arms for silence. Its voice resonated through the hall without need for translation devices, somehow understood by all who heard it. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. Humanity would be welcomed into the coalition, granted access to trade routes, technology exchanges, and colonization rights for uninhabited worlds. But there was one absolute condition that could never be violated. Elena had expected restrictions. Every new species faced them when joining the coalition. Some were forbidden from terraforming, others from certain types of genetic modification. But what the Primarch announced next made her blood run cold. Humanity was permanently forbidden from constructing any vessel classified as a military warship. No battlecruisers, no destroyers, no attack carriers. They could build cargo haulers, science vessels, and lightly armed patrol ships for dealing with pirates, but nothing designed primarily for warfare. The reasoning came next, delivered with the weight of 10,000 years of galactic history. The Coalition had studied Earth's history extensively before making first contact. In their entire database of sentient species, covering nearly 500 civilizations, none had demonstrated humanity's particular combination of tactical brilliance and destructive creativity. Where other species waged wars for resources or territory, humans had perfected the art of total war. They had split atoms to create weapons, engineered diseases as tools of conflict, and turned their own planet's atmosphere into a weapon during their climate wars of the 22nd century. Elena wanted to argue, to point out that humanity had moved beyond its violent past, that they had united as one world before reaching the stars, but she knew it would be futile. The Coalition had made their decision based on probability algorithms and historical analysis. To them, humanity was a loaded weapon, safer kept unloaded. The treaty was signed within the hour. Elena's signature sealed humanity's fate as the Coalition's most restricted member species. The years that followed proved the Coalition right, in a way. Humanity flourished without military ambitions. Their cargo ships became the fastest and most efficient in known space. Human engineers revolutionized jump drive technology, cutting travel times by 30%. Their asteroid mining operations produced more rare minerals than any 3 other species combined. Human colonies spread across dozens of systems, each one a model of efficiency and innovation. Marcus Webb, Earth's leading shipwright, had been 25 when the treaty was signed. He dreamed of designing battleships that could dance between stars, of creating defensive systems that could protect entire worlds. Instead, he channeled his genius into civilian craft. His cargo haulers could withstand meteor storms that would shred other vessels. His mining ships had reinforced hulls that could ram through asteroids. Every design pushed the boundaries of what was technically civilian, incorporating features that anyone with military knowledge would recognize as having dual purposes. 20 years passed in relative peace. A new generation of humans grew up knowing only the Coalition's protection, never questioning why humanity alone was singled out for such restrictions. They attended Coalition universities, learned alien languages, and formed friendships across species lines. The old military academies on Earth became historical museums, their strategic simulations relegated to entertainment programs. Then the Devourers arrived from beyond the galactic edge, and everything changed. They came without warning, without communication, without mercy. The first systems to encounter them simply went dark. No distress signals, no survivor accounts, just silence where billions of lives had been. When Coalition scouts finally reached these dead systems, they found planets stripped of all organic matter, atmospheres harvested. Even the electromagnetic fields that protected worlds from cosmic radiation had been consumed. The Coalition mobilized its peacekeeping forces, vast fleets that had maintained order for millennia. These ships were works of art, designed for show as much as function, their weapons precise and elegant. They engaged the Devourers at the Battle of Kelros Prime, confident in their numerical superiority and technological advancement. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the entire coalition fleet was gone, consumed by an enemy that adapted to every weapon, learned from every tactic, and grew stronger with each ship it devoured. Panic spread through coalition space faster than any plague. The Devourers moved systematically, consuming outer systems and working their way toward the galactic core. Coalition forces tried new strategies, different weapons, even attempts at communication. Nothing worked. The enemy was not interested in negotiation or conquest in any traditional sense. They simply consumed and moved on, leaving dead space in their wake. On Earth, Elena Vasquez, now Admiral of Humanity's Merchant Marine, watched the news feeds with growing frustration. She saw coalition ships form elegant battle lines that the Devourers simply overwhelmed. She watched commanders make tactical errors that first-year cadets at the old academies would have avoided. The coalition had maintained peace for so long, they had forgotten how to wage war. They fought like philosophers, not soldiers. The breaking point came when New Eden fell. It was a human colony, one of their most successful, with 15 million inhabitants. The Coalition Defense Force assigned to protect it retreated when the Devourers approached, claiming they needed to regroup and form a better strategy. Elena watched the feeds as evacuation ships, civilian vessels never designed for such speeds, tried desperately to escape. Less than 1 million made it out before the planet was consumed. That night, in a secure bunker beneath Mount Cheyenne, the remnants of Earth's old military command held their first meeting in 20 years. They had never truly disbanded, merely gone underground, maintaining shadow networks and theoretical planning sessions. Elena stood before them, her Merchant Marine uniform replaced with the old Earth Force insignia she'd kept hidden for 2 decades. The discussion was brief. Everyone present knew what had to be done. The coalition treaty was now toilet paper, worthless against an enemy that recognized no laws or agreements. Earth's president, a young woman named Sarah Kim who had been 5 when the treaty was signed, gave the authorization with tears in her eyes. She understood that they were not just breaking a treaty, but potentially making enemies of the coalition itself. Marcus Webb received the call at 3 in the morning. He'd been expecting it for weeks, his workshop already filled with designs he'd claimed were for new cargo vessels. Within hours, every shipyard from Luna to the asteroid belt received new blueprints. The designs were unlike anything the coalition had ever seen. Where their ships were works of art, these were weapons of war, ugly, brutal things designed to take massive damage and keep fighting. The hulls were not the smooth, aesthetically pleasing curves favored by the coalition, but angular, overlapping plates that could be replaced quickly in battle. The weapon systems were redundant to the point of absurdity. If primary weapons failed, secondary systems would engage. If those failed, tertiary systems activated. The ships were designed to fight even while dying, to ram enemies if all else failed, to self-destruct with enough force to take entire enemy fleets with them. But it was the tactical doctrine that truly set human warships apart. Coalition forces fought with honor, maintaining safe distances and engaging in what they considered civilized warfare. Human doctrine called for close-quarters combat, boarding actions, and psychological warfare. They would use gravity wells as weapons, hide in the radiation shadows of stars, and turn space debris into improvised ammunition. The announcement came 72 hours after New Eden fell. President Kim stood before the cameras, addressing not just humanity, but the entire coalition. Her words were carefully chosen, respectful but firm. The treaty forbidding human warship construction was null and void. Humanity would build a war fleet with or without coalition approval. They would fight the Devourers, and anyone who tried to stop them would be considered an enemy combatant. The coalition's response was immediate and predictable. Threats of sanctions, demands for compliance, warnings of military action if humanity proceeded. Ambassador Tekrel of the Korthani, whose species had sponsored humanity's entry into the coalition, personally visited Earth to deliver an ultimatum. Stand down or face complete isolation from coalition space. Elena met him at the orbital station above Earth. Behind her, through the transparent aluminum windows, the first human warship in 20 years was already taking shape. It was a monster of a vessel, 2 kilometers long, bristling with weapons that violated every coalition standard for civilized warfare. She listened to Teckrell's threats politely, then responded with words that would echo through coalition history. The coalition had forgotten the most important lesson about humanity. They didn't just excel at war. They thrived on being told they couldn't do something. Every great leap in human history came from someone saying something was impossible, forbidden or unwise. The coalition had made the ultimate mistake. They had told humanity they weren't allowed to build warships. They had warned them of consequences, and humanity had decided to do it anyway. When rules are meant to be broken, the transformation of human space into a military-industrial complex took less than 6 months. Every civilian shipyard was retrofitted for warship production. Mining operations doubled their output. Scientists who had spent decades working on theoretical physics suddenly found unlimited funding for weapons research. The entire human economy restructured itself with an efficiency that terrified coalition observers. Marcus Webb stood in the primary construction bay of Lunar Shipyard Alpha, watching welding drones assemble the flagship of humanity's new fleet. The UES Defiance was unlike anything in coalition databases. Her hull was a patchwork of ablative armor and reactive plating, designed to shed damaged sections while keeping critical systems operational. Her weapons arrays included everything from primitive kinetic railguns to experimental singularity projectors that skirted the edge of coalition-banned technology. The ship's captain, James Rodriguez, had been a cargo hauler for 15 years. Before that, he'd been one of Earth Force's most promising tactical officers. He'd spent 2 decades flying freight, all the while running combat simulations in his spare time, keeping his skills sharp for a day he'd hoped would never come. Now, standing on the bridge of humanity's first true warship, he felt like he'd finally come home. The coalition's attempts to stop human military production began with economic sanctions. Human traders were banned from coalition stations. Their cargo ships were turned away from major ports. It was meant to cripple Earth's economy and force compliance. Instead, it freed up resources for military production. Every civilian ship that couldn't trade was melted down and rebuilt as a weapon of war. Next came the blockades. Coalition peacekeepers surrounded human systems, preventing any military vessels from leaving. It was a strategy that might have worked against any other species. But humans had spent their entire history finding ways around obstacles. They disassembled warships, shipped them in pieces labeled as mining equipment, and reassembled them outside coalition jurisdiction. They hid weapons in civilian hulls. They turned asteroids into concealed military bases. The Primarch itself came to Earth for one final negotiation. The ancient being had lived for 50,000 years and had seen the rise and fall of dozens of warrior species. It understood what humanity was becoming and feared it. In the old United Nations building in New York, now a historical monument, it met with President Kim and Admiral Vasquez. The conversation was surprisingly civil. The Primarch explained that the coalition's restrictions weren't meant as an insult, but as a safeguard. Every warrior species they'd encountered had eventually turned on the coalition itself. The Septari had conquered 30 systems before being stopped. The Voidlings had tried to establish a military dictatorship over the entire galaxy. In each case, the coalition had barely survived. They couldn't risk humanity following the same path. Elena understood the fear. She even sympathized with it. But she also pointed to the star charts showing devourer advancement. In 6 months, they'd consumed 40 systems. At their current rate, they would reach Earth within 2 years and the coalition core worlds within 3. The coalition's peaceful methods had failed completely. It was time to try humanity's way. The Primarch made one final offer. If humanity would accept coalition military oversight, limiting their fleet to defensive actions only, and agreeing to decommission all warships once the devourer threat was eliminated, the restrictions would be temporarily lifted. It was a reasonable compromise, one that any sensible species would accept. President Kim's response was a single word that didn't translate well into any coalition language, but carried unmistakable meaning: no. 3 days later, the first human war fleet launched. 24 ships of various classes, from small corvettes to the massive Defiance, formed up in attack formation and jumped toward the front lines. They didn't ask for coalition permission or coordination. They simply went to war. The Battle of Proxima Station would be studied by military historians for millennia. The Devourers had besieged the coalition's primary research facility in the Proxima sector for 2 weeks. Coalition forces had established a defensive perimeter, but were slowly being overwhelmed. Their tactics were predictable, their weapons ineffective against an enemy that adapted to everything they tried. The human fleet arrived without warning, jumping directly into the combat zone in violation of every safety protocol. Coalition commanders screamed warnings about coordination and friendly fire. Captain Rodriguez ignored them all. The human ships didn't form battle lines or establish communication protocols. They attacked like wolves, each ship operating independently but somehow perfectly coordinated. The Devourers, for the first time since their appearance, hesitated. They had adapted to energy weapons, so the humans used kinetic rounds. When the enemy adjusted to those, the humans switched to chemical explosives, something so primitive the Devourers had no frame of reference for it. When the enemy started analyzing chemical compositions, the humans began ramming attacks, turning their own ships into weapons. The corvette UES Vengeance, critically damaged and venting atmosphere, accelerated to maximum speed and plowed directly into a Devourer command node. The explosion, enhanced by the ship's self-destruct system, created a chain reaction that destroyed 6 enemy vessels. The crew's final transmission was a battle hymn, sung in harmony as they died. But it was the boarding actions that truly demonstrated humanity's approach to warfare. Coalition forces had never considered boarding Devourer ships. It was considered suicidal. Humans didn't just consider it. They specialized in it. Marine teams in powered armor, wielding weapons that would have been considered war crimes by Coalition standards, carved their way through Devourer vessels. Lieutenant Maria Santos led the first successful capture of a Devourer ship. Her team of 12 Marines used a combination of electromagnetic pulses, chemical weapons, and good old-fashioned explosives to disable the vessel's organic components. When asked later how they'd succeeded where Coalition forces had failed, she simply said they'd stopped thinking of the enemy as invincible and started thinking of them as problems to be solved. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it ended, the Devourer force was completely destroyed. The human fleet had lost 8 ships and over 3,000 personnel. By Coalition standards, such losses were catastrophic. By human standards, it was an acceptable price for victory. More importantly, they had proven that the Devourers could be beaten. The Coalition response was mixed. Some species called for immediate military action against humanity for violating the treaty. Others, particularly those whose worlds were in the Devourer's path, quietly began requesting human protection. The Primarch, displaying wisdom earned over millennia, made a decision that would reshape the galaxy. The Coalition would not sanction humanity. Instead, they would offer a new treaty. Humans could maintain their military forces for the duration of the Devourer crisis. In exchange, they would share their tactical knowledge and help train Coalition forces in what the Primarch called aggressive defense. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, which made it perfect. Marcus Webb's next generation of warships incorporated lessons learned from Proxima Station. They were even uglier than the first batch, bristling with weapons that seemed to have been attached at random, but each placement was carefully calculated for maximum overlapping fields of fire. The ships looked like flying scrapyards, but they were absolutely lethal. The war against the Devourers continued for 3 more years. Human fleets, often operating alongside Coalition forces they'd trained, slowly pushed the enemy back. Each battle saw new tactics, new weapons, and new levels of controlled brutality that made Coalition observers uncomfortable. But it worked. System by system, the galaxy was reclaimed. The final battle took place at the edge of known space, where the Devourers had established their primary staging ground. It was a massive structure, part ship, part space station, part organic nightmare. Coalition strategists had run 1,000 simulations and concluded it was impregnable. Admiral Vasquez looked at their analysis, laughed, and asked Marcus Webb for something special. What Webb delivered was humanity's magnum opus of destruction. The UES last argument was less a ship and more a guided missile the size of a small moon. Its entire purpose was to accelerate to near light speed and impact the Devourer structure with enough force to crack a planet. It was piloted by volunteers who knew they wouldn't be coming back. Captain Alexandra Chen, descendant of Earth's first ambassador to the Coalition, commanded the last argument on its final mission. As the ship accelerated toward its target, she broadcast a message on all frequencies. It was a simple statement that would become humanity's unofficial motto in the years that come. You told us we couldn't, you warned us we shouldn't, we did it anyway. This is what happens when you tell humans no. The impact was visible from 3 systems away. The Devourer structure didn't just die. It ceased to exist on a molecular level. The enemy's coordinated intelligence, spread across thousands of vessels, collapsed without its central node. Within hours, the remaining Devourer forces began consuming each other in a cannibalistic frenzy that ended their threat permanently. In the aftermath, as the galaxy celebrated survival, the Coalition faced a dilemma. Humanity had saved them all, but they'd done it by becoming exactly what the Coalition had feared. They were now the premier military power in known space, with weapons and tactics that made other species nervous. The old treaty was obviously dead, but what would replace it? The solution came from humanity itself. President Kim, in a speech that surprised everyone, announced that Earth would voluntarily limit its military production. Not because anyone could force them to, but because they chose to. They would maintain a defensive fleet and share their knowledge with any coalition member who requested it. But they would not become conquerors. The coalition accepted this offer with relief and not a small amount of skepticism. They established monitoring stations around human shipyards and embedded observers in Earth's military command. But everyone knew the truth. If humanity decided to build warships again, no one could stop them. They had proven that when humanity was backed into a corner, when they were told they couldn't do something, they would find a way to do it anyway. Admiral Vasquez retired after the war, returning to Earth to teach at the reopened military academies. She would often tell her students about the 20 years when humanity was forbidden from building warships, and how that prohibition had ultimately saved the galaxy, not because it prevented human aggression, but because it had forced humanity to remember who they really were when the crisis came. Marcus Webb continued designing ships, both military and civilian. His designs became the standard across human space. Ugly, functional things that could switch from cargo hauling to combat in minutes. When asked why he didn't make them more aesthetically pleasing like coalition vessels, he would smile and say that beauty was found in survival, not appearance. The galaxy had learned an important lesson about humanity. They were dangerous not because they were naturally violent, but because they were naturally defiant. Tell them they cannot do something and they will find a way. Forbid them from building weapons and they will turn everything into a weapon. Try to restrict them, and they will break free. It was not a flaw to be corrected, but a strength to be respected. Years later, when new threats emerged from dark space, the Coalition's first response was not to mobilize their own forces, but to send a message to Earth with a simple question: can you help? And humanity's response was equally simple. We warned you we would build warships. Now be grateful we did.